Earlier this week, we talked about how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Another way that we learned how to solve, or another way that we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations is by using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So when you're using the quadratic formula, you have three steps you need to do. The first step is to write the equation in standard form. Standard form being ax squared plus bx plus c. That means everything is on the same side of the equal sign. After that, your second step is to identify a, b, and c and substitute them into the formula. And then the last step is to simplify. So if I'm using my formula, number one, step one is to get everything in standard form. Ax plus bx equals c. Well, if I look, all of my stuff is on one side of the equation, and that's what I want. So step two is to identify a. Remember, a is in front of x squared, so in this case, a is equal to 1. B is in front of x, so b is 2. And c is the constant that's on the end. So in this case, c is negative 63. So using the quadratic formula, I'm going to have the opposite of b. So if b is positive 2, it's now negative 2. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. So it's going to be 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, all over 2 times a. So the numbers that we put in for a, b, and c was here, 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 and here. Everything else was part of the formula. So the numbers you see in red is what we put in. Everything else is the formula. So now let's go ahead and try to simplify this problem. So I'm going to have x equals negative 2 is going to stay negative 2 plus or minus the square root. Well, 2 squared is 4. And then I'm going to multiply negative 4 times 1 times negative 63. And that is going to give me 252. But because it's a negative times a negative, it's going to be positive 252 over 2 times 1. So it's going to be 2. Well, 252 plus 4 now is going to give me the square root of 254. I'm sorry, not 254, 256. 256 divided by 2. The square root of 256 is a perfect square, and you're going to get x equals negative 2 plus or minus 16, because the square root of 256 is 16 over 2. Now here I have two answers, not one, two, because I have a plus or minus in the middle. So my first answer is going to be negative 2 plus 16 divided by 2. And my second answer is going to be negative 2 minus 16 divided by 2. Well, negative 2 plus 16 is going to give me 14 divided by 2, which is 7. My second answer is going to be negative 6 to minus 16, and it's going to give me negative 18 divided by 2, which gives me negative 9. So my answer to problem 1 is going to be x equals 7 comma negative 9. Problem 2. Here again, my first step is to label my A, B, and C. So A in this problem now is 6. B is negative 11. And C is negative 10. So using my formula, I'm going to say x equals negative 11 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times 6 times negative 10. All over 2 times 6. So let's try to simplify. X equals a negative and a negative, so right here, become a positive. So it's now 11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared is 121. Well, negative 4 times 6 times negative 10 is going to be positive 240 all over 2 times 6 is 12. Combine your number inside the square root. So 240 plus 121 is 361 over 12. Square root 361, and it again is another perfect square. So you're going to get 11 plus or minus 19 over 12. Split it up into your two equations, and you're going to get x equals 11 plus 19 over 12, and x equals 11 minus 19 over 12. So those are my two equations. I just have to simplify. So 11 plus 19 is going to be 30 divided by 12, which will also simplify again. A number that will go into both 12 and 30 is 6. 30 divided by 6 is 5. 12 divided by 6 is 2. So that's the answer to my first set, 5 over 2. 11 minus 19 is going to be negative 8 over 12, which also can reduce. A number that will go into both 8 and 12 is 4. So negative 8 divided by 4 gives me negative 2. So all I'm doing is dividing this by 4 and dividing this number by 4. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. So that my final answer is x equals 5/2 and negative 2/3. Remember, at any time you need help in this video, please raise your hand and I will come and help you. So if we look at problem 3 is just a little bit different. Everything is not on one side of the equation. So I have to move the 1 before I can start. So to get 1 to the other side of the equation, I'm going to subtract both sides by 1. So that I get negative x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. Now I can label my A, B, and C. So if you look at the number in front of x squared, the number is negative 1. The number in front of x is 2, and the number with no variable, or the constant, is also negative 1. So plug it into your formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. Simplify. X equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root. 2 squared is 4, and negative 4 times negative 1 times negative 1 is going to give me negative 4 all over 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So simplify again. X equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 0, because 4 minus 4 is 0, over negative 2. The square root of 0 is just 0. So when I do plus or minus 0, well, adding or subtracting 0 isn't going to change anything. So all I really have now is x equals negative 2 divided by negative 2, which is positive 1. So my final answer is x equals 1. Number 4. I still have to move everything over. Move the 4x and the 15. Or I'm sorry, the negative 15. So I have to subtract the 4x and add 15. And I'm going to add it right here because I ran out of room. So I'm going to be left with negative 2x squared. Combine your like terms. So it's going to be negative x plus 15 equals 0, because those cancel out. Label A, B, C. My A is negative 2, my B is negative 1, and my C is 15. Plug it into your formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. So if you see, it's just a repetition of the formula over and over and over. So I'm going to have x equals positive 1 plus or minus negative 1 squared is 1. Negative 4 times negative 2 times 15 is going to be positive 120 over 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. So x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 121 over 4. So all I did was simplify 1 plus 120. Well, the square root of 121 is 11. So I'm going to get x equals 1 plus or minus 11 over 4. When you break that up into your two equations, you're going to get you're going to get 1 plus 11 over 4 and 1 minus 11 over 4. So 1 plus 11 is 12. 12 divided by 4 is 3. 1 minus 11 is negative 10 over 4. And a number that will go into both negative 10 and 4 is 2. So negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So your final answer is x equals negative 5 halves, comma, 3. Number 5. On number 5, you still have to move the 24 over. So I'm going to subtract 24 from both sides, so that I get 9x squared. Well, I don't have an x, so I don't have to write it. And then I have negative 1 minus 24, which is going to give me negative 25 equals 0. I still label my A, B, C's. For this problem, my A is 9. My B is the number in front of x. If you don't have that variable, like you don't have just x, then your letter is going to be 0. And my C is going to be negative 25. So from here, plug it in. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. Well, negative 0, that's not going to change anything. So you don't even have to write that. So your answer is going to be x equals plus or minus 0 squared. Well, 0 times 0 is 0. So there again, you don't need to write it. So you need to do negative 4 times 9 times negative 25 to get 900 over 2 times 9 is 18. Well, the square root of 900 is 30. So you really have plus or minus 30 over 18. So you're going to do 30 divided by 18 and negative 30 divided by 18. Well, a number that will go into both 30 and 18 is 6. So divide top and bottom by 6. 30 divided by 6 is 5. 18 divided by 6 is 3. So my first answer is 5 over 3. So do the same thing with the other side. Negative 30 divided by 6 is negative 5. 18 divided by 6 is 3. So my other answer is going to be negative 5 over 3. Problem 6. On this one, first you need to subtract the 10x to the other side, so that I get 8x squared minus 10x equals 0. label ABC, and I get A is equal to 8, B is negative 10, and I don't have a C on this one, so on this example, C is 0. Plug it into your formula, and you're going to get X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. Simplify, negative and a negative become a positive 10, plus or minus negative 10 squared is 100. Well, negative 4 times 8 times 0. Anytime you times anything by 0, your answer is always going to get 0. So it's going to be plus 0. But when you add 0 to anything, it doesn't change. So all I have now is the square root of 100 over 2 times 8, which is 16. Well, 100 is a perfect square, so I'm going to get 10 plus or minus, the square root of 100 is 10 over 16. Split your equation up into 2, and you're going to get X equals 10 plus 10 divided by 16, and 10 minus 10 divided by 16. Well, 10 plus 10 is 20, divided by 16 will reduce. I'm going to move this out of my way a little bit. A number that will go into both 10 or 20 and 16 is 4. 20 divided by 4 is 5. 16 divided by 4 is 4. So my first answer is X equals 5/4. Well, 10 minus 10 is 0. Divided by 16 is 0. So my two answers is 0 and 4/5. 0 can be an answer, so you have to write it down. So let's look at the back. On problem number 7, you have to remember that all of your numbers have to be on the same side before you can label A, B, and C. So on this problem, the first step I need to do is move the 4x over. To move 4x over, all you're going to do is subtract 4x from both sides. So you're left with x squared minus 4x minus 9 equals 0. Label your ABCs. A is equal to 1. B is equal to negative 4. C is equal to negative 9. And plug it into your formula so that you get x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. From here, you are going to simplify everywhere that you can. So you know that x equals 2 negatives become a positive, so it's going to be 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared is 16, and negative 4 times 1 times negative 9 is going to give me a positive 36 all over 2. So when I combine these numbers, I'm going to get 4 plus or minus the square root of 52 over 2. Now, the square root of 52 is not a whole number. So when you simplify the square root of 52, I'm going to go over here and do a little side note. A perfect square that will go into 52 is 4 for sure. There might have been another one, but let's just use 4. Okay, so square root both numbers. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 13 is the square root of 13. Well, there's no other perfect squares that will go into 13, so this is my reduced answer. So my answer is going to be x equals 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 13 over 2. This can be simplified again. To simplify this problem, you have to look at these numbers. What will go into both 4, 2, and 2? 2. So that when I do x equals 4 divided by 2 is 2, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1. Square root of 13, you leave square root of 13 alone. And 2 divided by 2 is 1. So you can write your final answer as x equals 2 plus or minus square root of 13. That is your final answer for number 7. Number 8. On this one, I'm going to subtract 8x to both sides and add 1. So that when I combine my like terms, I get negative 2x squared minus 8x plus 18 equals 0. Label your ABCs. A equals negative 2, B equals negative 8, and C equals 18. Plug it into your formula, and you're going to get x equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. All over 2A. Simplify. X equals positive 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared, or negative 8 squared is a positive 64, plus negative 4 times negative 2 times 18 is 144, all over negative 4. So I'm just simplifying my problem. From here, combine what's inside the square root. So I get 8 plus or minus the square root of 208 over negative 4. There again, 208 is not a perfect square, so I need to square root it, or simplify it. One perfect square that will go into 208 is 16. 16 times 13 is equal to 208. So square root both numbers. And when you square root 16, you get 4 with the square root of 13. So when I write it, I'm going to have x equals 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 13 over negative 4. There again, here's another number that will go into both 8, 4, and negative 4, and that is 4. So when I divide these numbers by 4, I'm going to get x equals 8 divided by 4 is 2, plus or minus 4 divided by 4 is 1, so I'm going to be left with the square root of 13 over negative 1. With that negative 1 on bottom, my final answer is going to now become negative 2 plus or minus square root of 13. The reason why it only really changes the negative 2 sign is because my square root is positive and negative. So when I change the sign of a positive, I'm going to get a negative. And if I change the sign of a negative, I'm going to get a positive. So you still have a positive and negative 13, no matter which way you do it. So this is your final answer. Number 9. Move the 4 by subtracting 4 on both sides. And you get negative 8x squared plus 3. Label A, B, C. Well, A in this case is negative 8. Because I don't have an x term, B is going to be 0, and my C is going to be 3. So I'm going to use x equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. Well, negative 0. When you subtract 0 from anything, it's not going to change the problem. So I don't really have to write that again. So all I'm left with now is plus or minus the square root of 0 squared is going to be 0. When you do negative 4 times negative 8 times 3, you should have gotten 96. So it's the square root of 96 over negative 16. And I forgot a parentheses right there. So taking the square root of 96, to simplify it, I got to find a perfect square that will go into 96. And 16 will go into 96. So when you do 96 divided by 16, you should have gotten 6. So square root both, and you get 4 square root of 6. So here I'm going to get x equals plus or minus 4 square root of 6 over negative 16. What number will go into both 4 and 16? And now I'm going to redraw that circle because that's the jacked up circle. 4 and 16. The answer is 4. So when I do 4 divided by 4, I'm going to get plus or minus 1 square root of 6 over negative 4. here again, when you divide by a negative up here, it's just going to flip the signs. So you're going to have a negative and positive square root of 6. So you don't want your negatives to be in the denominator. So when you do that, your final answer is going to be plus or minus the square root of 6 over 4. Number 10. Subtract 8 from both sides, and you're going to get negative x squared plus 10x minus 8. Label A, B, C, and you get negative 1, positive 10, negative 8. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus B squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 8 all over 2a. You're going to get x equals negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 100, because 10 squared is 100. Negative 4 times negative 1 times negative 8 should give you negative 32 all over negative 2. When you simplify underneath, you're going to get negative 10 plus or minus 100 minus 32 is going to give you the square root of 68 over negative 2. A perfect square that will go into 68, so if I simplify 68, 4 will go into 68 17 times. So square root both sides, and you'll get 2 square root of 17. So I have x equals negative 10 plus or minus 2 square root of 17 all over negative 2. A number that will go into both negative 10, 2, and negative 2 is 2. So when you ask yourself, what is negative 10 divided by 2? It's going to give you negative 5 plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, so the square root of 17 over 2 divided by 2, negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. With a negative on bottom, you're going to end up with x equals positive 5 plus or minus square root of 17. Number 11. This problem's already set up in the order that you want it. You have your x squared plus your x plus your constant number. So here, all I have to do now is label my ABCs. So A is negative 3, B is positive 8, C is negative 7. Plug it into your formula. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus B squared minus 4 times A. I'll rewrite that 3 and then messed it up. So that's a negative 3 times C all over 2A. So I have x equals negative 8 plus or minus, and that should be squared. 8 squared is 64. When you do negative 4 times negative 3 times negative 7, you get negative 84 all over negative 6. Simplify your square root, and you'll get negative 20 over negative 6. When you are simplifying the negative 20, 20 can be broken down to negative 4 times 5. When you square root negative 4 and negative 5, negative 4 becomes 2i. You cannot forget the I. And the square root of 5 will stay as the square root of 5. Anytime you square root a negative number, you will always have an I that pulls out. So you're going to have x equals negative 8 plus or minus 2i square root of 5 divided by negative 6. From here, you are going to simplify these three numbers. A number that will go into all three of those numbers is 2. So when you do negative 8 divided by 2, you get negative 4. Plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1. So you're left with 1i square root of 5 over negative 6 divided by 2 is going to give you negative 3. Pull the negative up, and you're left with x equals 4 plus or minus I square root of 5 over 3. Last problem. On this problem, you have to move stuff over again. So I'm going to subtract 4x, subtract 5, and rewrite my problem. 5x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 0. Label ABC. A is 5, B is negative 4, C is positive 4. So when you plug it into your formula, you're going to do the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. So these problems are just memorizing the formula and doing it over and over and over again. So I'm going to have x equals positive 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 5 times 4 is going to give me negative 80 all over 10. Well, when you do 16 minus 80, you should have gotten negative 64 over 10. And the square root of negative 64, 64 being a perfect square, is going to give you 8. But because it's negative, you have to include I over 10. Here again, you have numbers that can simplify. You have 4, 8, and 10. A number that will go into both 4, 8, and 10 is 2. So you're left with 4 divided by 2 is 2. Plus or minus 8 divided by 2 is 4. I over 10 divided by 2 is 5. anytime you see a plus or minus sign, you are going to have two answers. So almost all of these problems that we just worked out have two answers to them. If you have any questions, feel free to go back and review the video and or raise your hand to ask for help.